Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today's video is essentially the third part in a series which has so far looked at the Palace of Whitehall and the execution of Charles I, those being two separate videos. I'll be sure to put both of those videos in a playlist and leave that playlist linked in a card. But now, it's time to, as I previously said that it would be, explore the moment, or perhaps that should more properly be the moments, that are often said to be the point of no return in the fall of King Charles I. I think it's time to consider whether it was all just inevitable, really. Let's look at it. So, as I mentioned, this is the last of three videos whose topics, at least for me, connect to each other. Perhaps somewhat perversely, as this is the last video that I will be uploading, today's topic is the one that led me on to wanting to discuss the other earlier topics. But what inspired me to go down this particular historical garden path was, and by sharing this, you are going to get a chilling insight into how my rabbit warren of a train of thought actually works, because what led me to make this series of videos was an advert that came on screen for an adaptation of Mike Bartlett's play King Charles III, which showed in the advert the moment that Charles enters the House of Commons in order to use his royal prerogative to dissolve Parliament. It was jarring to see a monarch striding into the House of Commons, because when our Queen takes part in the ceremonial state opening of Parliament, she does so from the House of Lords. A similar welcome would not be extended by the Commons to Her Majesty the Queen. Indeed, it has been almost 4 centuries since a monarch of this nation has entered the House of Commons. At least, that's the case as far as we know it. The monarch's exclusion from the chamber of the House of Commons became a matter of course following the actions of another Charles. It came from King Charles I's decision to enforce his own royal will there in the House of Commons on the 4th of January 1642. Charles Stuart was born on the 19th of November 1600 in Dunfermline Castle in Scotland to James VI of Scots and his wife Anne of Denmark. Charles was the couple's 3rd surviving child and 2nd son. His eldest sibling was 6 years his senior, named Henry and the heir to his father's throne. Their sister Elizabeth was 4 years old when Charles was born. Charles's father had been only 13 months old when the role of King of Scots was thrust upon him on the 24th of July 1567. But by the 24th of March 1603, he was a 36-year-old married man with 3 children, including an heir and a spare. And it was on this date that he also obtained the crown of England, due to the death of Queen Elizabeth I. While his father was busy becoming the monarch of 2 nations, Charles's early childhood was somewhat overshadowed by delayed and eventually stammering speech, and by an issue of weakness in his legs that we think might have been caused by rickets. Despite this, he would overcome the physical and linguistic difficulties of his early years, to the exclusion of the stammer, because that did stay with him for life. But in looking at this, I, like many others, would argue that he did overcome these things in large part through his own sheer bloody-mindedness. Indeed, M.A. Green points out that when Charles was 9 years old, he chose for his motto the following phrase: "If you would conquer all things, submit yourself to reason." From his earliest years, Charles had, it seems, convinced himself of his own personal ability, or even his right, to overcome any and all obstacles in order to bring his willed plans to their natural fruition. Unsurprisingly, when James learnt that he was to become the King of England, he travelled south. He left Edinburgh on the 4th of April 1603. His queen, Anne, would follow her husband later on. She used this delay to make a successful play to take her eldest son into her custody. Anne and Henry, the heir, left Scotland for England on the 1st of June 1603. As was common for royal and noble children, indeed, this would have been the plan for Henry until Anne derailed it, Charles was to be raised elsewhere. He remained behind in Scotland until he was 4. His upbringing during this period was overseen by Alexander Seton, who would later become the first Earl of Dunfermline. When he was 4 years old, he moved to England and into the household of Sir Robert Carey. Charles would not have long to settle himself into the role of spare to the heir, although these were his formative years. Because on the 6th of November 1612, just a few days before Charles's 12th birthday, a sudden illness that we think was typhoid took his elder brother Henry's life. Charles would be the chief mourner at his brother's funeral. At once, the spare became the heir. Charles's lived experience was suddenly rerouted. He was now the sole surviving male heir to the crowns of 2 kingdoms. He would need to be fast-tracked through his education for his new role, while also being protected as the spectacularly rare commodity that he now was. A few years later, in 1617, Charles was made Privy Councillor, and he sat on the Naval Commission. These were not simply ceremonial appointments. He was a member of the council that ruled England while his father returned to Scotland. And indeed, he would continue to make his presence felt in government. We know that he attended over 70% of the sessions of the House of Lords in 1621, for example, and that apparently he acted as its de facto leader in 1624. The next year, following his time as apparent de facto leader of the House of Lords, would see Charles elevated yet further. He would become King of Scots and King of England when his father died on the 27th of March 1625. We are told that James extracted 3 promises from his son and heir while he was on his deathbed. James made Charles promise that he would remain loyal to his chief confidant and father's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham. He made him promise to defend the church and look after the interests of his sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth's life had taken quite the turn. She had departed England within months of her brother Henry's death. Indeed, she left on the 26th of April 1613 as the wife of Frederick V, Elector Palatine. In late 1619, her husband was persuaded to accept the offer to sit on the throne of Bohemia. Elizabeth was, of course, beside him as the Queen of Bohemia. Unfortunately, this new position would not last long, and Elizabeth has come to be known as the Winter Queen of Bohemia. This is a mocking reference to the brevity of the reign, which came to an end on the 8th of November 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain, when Elizabeth's husband Frederick's Protestant force was defeated by a combined Catholic force made up of combatants representing the Habsburg monarchs, the German Catholic League, and the Spanish Empire. The sacred promises Charles had made to his father would, to varying degrees, sow the seeds of distrust and frustration between the new king and his parliament. When this was matched with the new king's own belief in his divine right to rule, escalation was, I would argue, inevitable. Charles's early months as king saw him take a Roman Catholic French princess as his wife, Henrietta Maria. Understandably, this was not without controversy, because, like the monarchs before and indeed after him, Charles was dealing with the fallout from Henry VIII's reformation of the Church. And indeed, the direction of the Church of England was still being hotly contested. In many ways, the gulf of division had simply grown even larger. There were some in the nation who hoped for greater toleration of Roman Catholic worship. Some even sought to encourage or force a return to the papal fold. Charles had made promises of concessions to secure his marriage treaty to his Catholic princess. Meanwhile, others had polarised in the opposite direction, and they sought a puritanical shift. Some who felt this way were members of the Parliament that the king was trying to work with, or perhaps control, and what you think is going on in that regard depends on your point of view. Complicating matters yet further was the sheer number of other sects that had and would continue to emerge, each with their own ardent beliefs about the way the Church of England should operate. Charles was thus trying to steer the ship of the Church of England through a metaphorical storm. He and it risked being shipwrecked. Charles and Henrietta Maria, who had been married by proxy at the church door of Notre Dame on the 1st of May 1625, would eventually become man and wife in the fullest, most complete sense on the 13th of June 1625. A few days later, on the 18th of June, Charles opened Parliament. He was hoping to secure the necessary funds to offer military support to his sister Elizabeth, and thus fulfil the promise he had made to his father on his father's deathbed. After some back and forth, the king's request of 3 full subsidies to attack the Spanish became 2 subsidies without 15ths. This was a tax that was charged on the basis of the value of movable goods that was standardised at 1/15th in the counties and 1/10th in the towns. This voted subsidy would not be enough, and Charles and Parliament must have known this. Nevertheless, Charles would accept it, and he would allow his ministers to adjourn. They were all keen to avoid the plague, which was ravaging much of the country at the time of this Parliament. Charles called upon the Parliament to reconvene at Oxford on the 1st of August 1525, so that they could be prevailed upon to provide more funds to support his war effort. This move was spectacularly unpopular, not least because the plague had already spread to Oxford before the MPs arrived. Despite this being Charles's own design, the Duke of Buckingham was on the receiving end of the condemnation for it. Members of Parliament complained about him. They believed he advised the king poorly and recognised him as an incompetent military leader, which was all the more problematic when you consider that Buckingham occupied the role of Lord Admiral. Additionally, the Parliament criticised the management of foreign policy and ultimately refused to give Charles what he wanted. Protecting the Church of England, his sister, and Buckingham would, apparently, be a near impossible task if Charles wanted to avoid conflict with his Parliament. Unfortunately, it seems that Charles took his promises to his dying father very seriously. The strains in his relationship with Parliament would only get worse during their next meetings. From before he was king, and through the early years of his reign, the Duke of Buckingham was the person who was closest to Charles. He was his chief companion, confidant, and advisor. But he was assassinated on the 23rd of August 1628. Understandably, Charles was devastated. Nevertheless, the removal of this seemingly professional irritant appears to have done nothing to smooth the relationship between king and Parliament. The mass of irritations, tensions and downright conflict all seems to have come to the boil when Parliament was summoned in 1629. The topic at the front of Charles's mind was once again money. He wished to secure a parliamentary grant in order for him to continue to collect the levy that he had been collecting from the start of his reign, that of tonnage and poundage. Parliament wanted to discuss, read, criticise Charles's religious policy. Charles's response was to dissolve Parliament. He accused members of the House of seditious conduct, and he had 9 of them arrested. From 1629 to 1640, Charles refused to call Parliament. Now, as Parliament had the legal right to raise the taxes that could support Charles's hoped-for war effort, he would have to come to terms with peace, and he would have to rely on his royal rights and prerogatives if he was going to supply any money to his own treasury. Charles may have backed off from European conflict, but he would find himself embattled closer to home. Charles was an absent King of Scots. So much so, he didn't find time to travel there to be formally crowned until 1633. He was, however, keen to do as his father had intended and introduce a consistent form of worship into the Scottish Kirk. In 1637, a new prayer book, billed as being conservatively modified, was introduced. It caused widespread displeasure in Charles's ancestral home, which ultimately spilled over into rebellion. The situation became unmanageable, and Charles was seemingly unwilling to wait and see how the Scottish situation might play out. He was determined to mount a successful military campaign to bring his rebellious northern subjects, as he saw them, to heel. Parliament was summoned for the first time in 11 years. This session would come to be known as the Short Parliament, as it would only sit from the 13th of April to the 5th of May 1640, before being dissolved by the King. According to Mark A. Kishlansky and John Morrill, Charles's next move was, quote, the single greatest miscalculation of his career. He decided to invade Scotland without the necessary money. It was a disaster. The Scottish combatants crossed the border and refused to return home until their war costs were paid, and until they had obtained a promise of increased liberties for Scotland. The next Parliament would sit from the 3rd of November 1640, and it would not be formally dissolved until 1660. It would become known, imaginatively as ever, as the Long Parliament. This Parliament was quick to pass a bill, in February 1641, that would prevent Charles from dissolving Parliament again without their prior consent. They proceeded to curb Charles's will and authority. He saw his advisers sent to the Tower, and, at his MP's behest, he banished Roman Catholics or Papists from his court and from London. On the 13th of August 1641, Charles left England for Scotland. While he was there, on the 25th of August, as if to add insult to injury, Charles signed a treaty that reduced his powers in Scotland to virtually nothing. Charles stayed in Scotland for 15 weeks before returning to England. He would arrive back in London on the 25th of November 1641. He returned to bad news, which had reached London at the start of the month. Rebellion had broken out in Ireland. November 1641 was a busy time in Parliament, and not simply because they were dealing with news of the Irish Rebellion, but principally because they were debating the contents of the so-called Grand Remonstrance. This was made up of more than 200 complaints, and it set out all of Charles's perceived errors of governance that had begun at the time of his accession. The decision to publish its contents squeaked through in a vote in the House of Commons. It passed by a relatively small margin of 159 to 148 votes. From this, we can perhaps see that the Parliament itself was divided. Charles convinced himself that the unrest that was being fuelled by this division was as intolerable to most of his MPs and subjects as it was to him. So, he should obviously take action to free his government and people from the threats that were being fostered by allowing his critics to continue in the Parliament. Psst, psst. This would be a very bad idea. I'm going to return to the work of Kiszlansky and Morrill because I want to share their concise account of the disastrous events that were about to follow. On the 3rd of January 1642, Charles instructed the Attorney General, Sir Edward Herbert, to make a statement in the House of Commons, accusing 5 members of the Commons and 1 member of the Lords of high treason. He had arranged for George Digby to follow up immediately on Herbert's speech with a demand for their immediate imprisonment. But Digby panicked and sat mute. This forced Charles into a much riskier manoeuvre the following day, an attempt to arrest the accused men as they sat in Parliament. But his intentions became apparent, and the intended victims were forewarned. The MP slipped away, as the King, attended by about 100 troopers, entered the Palace of Westminster. It was a major blunder, and it caused the King to lose his nerve completely. It also halted the drift of moderate opinion back to the King, and it absolutely confirmed the worst fears of Charles's critics. In the days that followed, Charles could not move out of the inner sanctums of Whitehall without hearing jeering, angry crowds. When he addressed the City Fathers at the Guildhall on the 5th of January, he asked, and there is no reason to doubt his honesty, "Who says I do not take the advice of my Parliament? I do take their advice, and will, but I must distinguish between the Parliament and some traitors to it." He was heckled. "I have and will observe all the privileges of Parliament, but no privilege will protect a traitor from a legal trial," he went on. But the heckling continued. Charles's greatest misstep was to make his conflict personal, which he did by going in person, not sending some loyal advisor, someone who could be blamed as an evil counsellor, or even potentially disavowed should the arrest mission fail, which, as we know, it did. I believe, contrary to Kiszlansky and Morrill, that this was the greatest single miscalculation of Charles's career, and that in this moment the King effectively signed his own death warrant. After all, the first major battle of the English Civil War would kick off later in the year after this failed arrest. It happened at Edgehill on the 23rd of November 1642. It would be a battle, or rather a war, for the soul of the nation. It would be one that the King and his supporters would, of course, ultimately lose. Charles had been viewed by his opponents as a burgeoning tyrant, who was dangerously infected by popery. By making war on Parliament, and through them, they would argue at least, his nation, Charles was, potentially, a traitor. Many among them saw him as a depraved individual, who deserved to be tried, and if convicted, even executed. However, it's possible to argue that things were not set in stone quite so early, that King Charles could have saved his life, if not his crown. By late 1648, it was clear that Charles and his cavaliers had lost the war. The king was under house arrest, but Parliament was seeking to come to terms. Among those suggested terms was an idea that King Charles could abdicate in favour of his son. On the 6th of December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride purged the House of Commons to create what was known as the Rump Parliament. This was a military coup. Still, overtures were being made to encourage Charles to abdicate in favour of his son. The alternative was execution. The Rump Parliament was saying, give up the throne for your son, save your own life, and the throne for your family. It all amounted to what feels like a game of chicken almost, but one where no one blinks. No one swerves out of the way to avoid each other. In January 1649, a charge of treason led to a trial, and then to a conviction, and then to the signing of a death warrant, and eventually to a public execution. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles suffered the noble traitor's punishment of beheading on the block on a scaffold. That scaffold was built in front of his father's banqueting house at Whitehall Palace. But what do you think? At what point did Charles's fate become inevitable? Or do you think there was always a way out? And if so, what was it and when? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can find me over on social media. I'll leave links to my Instagram and Twitter in the description box. Follow me there and we can continue this conversation. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with some friends? Please also let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you think you are subscribed, maybe have a little check now to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking or subscribing, why not also hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.